Early Saturday morning, February 28th, 2026, the world woke up to the headline people had been fearing for years. The United States and Israel had just launched a large-scale military attack on Iran. It started with a cyber attack that shut down a large part of Iran's communications and radar systems. Right after that, Tomahawk missiles began hitting military bases and missile platforms. Then stealth aircraft entered Iranian airspace. F-35s and F-22s and B-2 bombers. The strikes directly targeted missile bases, radar systems, and command centers. And within just a few hours, something even more shocking started spreading everywhere. Iran's supreme leader had been killed. The kind of news that could set the entire Middle East on fire. But Iran didn't wait long to respond. Missiles were launched toward Israeli territory, and others targeted American bases in the Gulf. In a single moment, the old rules of engagement were gone, and the door opened to a much wider regional confrontation. Now here is the thing. This war wasn't decided by the American people, but they were the ones who paid its price. The soldiers who died in it were Americans, and the money burned in this war came from American taxpayers. And this is where the real question starts. The ones a lot of people don't even like to ask. Was this war really meant to make America great again? Or was it also tied to security calculations involving Israel and Washington's allies in the region? Who actually set this war in motion, and why now? Who stands to benefit the most from it? How could this conflict end? And how far might it spread? Was this war fought for the security of the United States, or for weapons companies that made billions of dollars within just a few days? And is this actually what Donald Trump promised Americans? And in the end, how will this war affect all of us and the world economy? So my friend, grab your favorite drink and don't forget to hit the like and subscribe if you haven't yet. And now, let's get into it. To understand why this war exploded the way it did, we need to step back for a moment, because what happened at dawn on February 28th, 2026 wasn't a sudden decision. This war had been forming slowly for many years. In fact, the whole story really starts more than 20 years ago, back when the world discovered that Iran was building a secret nuclear program. In 2002, the first reports appeared about hidden nuclear facilities inside Iran, and from that moment on, the real confrontation began. International sanctions, regular inspections of nuclear facilities, long negotiations, and constant accusations from both sides, until we reached the historic agreement in 2015. A deal Iran signed with 6 major world powers: the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Russia, and China. The agreement became known as the Iran nuclear deal, and in very simple terms, it had one main goal: to completely restrict Iran's nuclear program. Under the deal, Iran had to drastically scale down its nuclear activities. Its stockpile of enriched uranium was reduced from about 8,000 kilograms to less than 400 kilograms. The level of enrichment was also limited to a low percentage that could not be used to build a nuclear weapon. A large number of centrifuges were dismantled, and most importantly, Iran's nuclear facilities were placed under constant monitoring, cameras running 24 hours a day, and inspectors from the International Atomic Energy Agency regularly entering the sites. The path toward building a nuclear bomb became extremely difficult, and for several years, it actually looked like the crisis was over. But that didn't last long. Netanyahu was one of the strongest critics of the nuclear deal, and one of the loudest voices calling for a military strike against Iranian's nuclear program. Then, on May 8, 2018, Donald Trump made a decision that changed everything. He announced that the United States would withdraw from the Iranian nuclear deal. That decision brought the sanctions back. At that moment, the deal itself was still in place, and Iranian's nuclear program was under international monitoring. But Trump argued that the agreement was bad for the United States, so he decided to pull out. And from that point on, the countdown to the war we're seeing today had essentially begun. In international international politics, wars rarely start overnight. They usually begin the moment someone decides that diplomacy was no longer serves their interests. After the United States left the nuclear deal, Iran started slowly stepping away from the restrictions the agreement had imposed. At first, Tehran said it would continue respecting the deal, but American sanctions came back hard, and Iran's economy began to suffer. So after a few months, the limits started to unravel. The level of uranium enrichment began rising again. Centrifuges that had previously been dismantled were turned back on. Then things reached a much more dangerous stage. Iran announced it had reached 60% uranium enrichment. And that number isn't just another technical detail, because once a country reaches 60%, the jump to 90% weapons-grade uranium becomes very short. Israel leaders say that such level raised fears, because Iran had repeatedly been described as a potential existential threat to Israel. In other words, Iran was now on the threshold of a nuclear weapon. That's when the alarm bell started ringing in Washington. Iran is getting closer to the bomb. Iran is a global threat. But then, another question came up. If the old agreement had already been controlling Iran's nuclear program, why not just go back to that deal? The Trump administration believed pressure and sanctions would work better than agreement itself. In Tel Aviv, though, the message had been consistent for years. Netanyahu had repeating the same warning for nearly 2 decades. Iran is only months away from a nuclear bomb, and time is running out. Despite all the escalation, diplomacy never completely stopped. Last year, indirect negotiations began again between Washington and Tehran. Oman stepped in as a mediator. The goal was straightforward: bring nuclear restrictions back on Iran in exchange of easing the sanctions. And in the days just before the war started, there were reports suggesting a new agreement might actually be close. Some sources even said that Iran had agreed to stop enrichment and that the crisis might finally be resolved. But while diplomacy was moving slowly, Israel and the United States were preparing for something entirely different. In June of the previous year, a confrontation broke out between Israel and Iran that lasted around 12 days. During that conflict, the United States entered the fight directly. Netanyahu had been strongly pressuring Washington to strike Iran's nuclear facilities, and in the end, Donald Trump agreed to intervene. The United States used long-range P-2 stealth bombers. They targeted heavily fortified Iranian nuclear sites, using bunker-busting bombs designed to penetrate underground facilities. After the strikes ended, Trump announced that the operation had destroyed Iran's nuclear program. He said the main reactors had been eliminated and that the Iranian nuclear threat had been neutralized. In other words, at that moment, it sounded like the problem was over. But that raises a simple question. If Iran's nuclear program had really been destroyed, and if the reactors had already been hit, then why are we now facing an even larger war? If the threat had already been eliminated, why did this war begin in the first place? Days passed. The tension cooled down a little, and negotiations in Geneva were still going, as if things were moving slowly toward a diplomatic solution. But at the same time, inside war rooms in Washington and Tel Aviv, something very different was being prepared: a new military strike against Iran. Trump, the man who liked to present himself as a peace president, had become extremely confident. After what he saw as a successful operation in Venezuela, he believed the situation would be simple: 2 or 3 days of bombing, and Iran would collapse the same way. So on February 28, 2026, Donald Trump officially announced that the United States was entering the war. He also announced the start of a US military campaign called Epic Fury. This operation was coordinated with the Israeli campaign already underway, Roar of the Lion. And the speech that followed sounded strangely familiar. Iran is a threat to the world. Iran is getting close to a nuclear weapon. We must act before it's too late. A lot of people felt like they had heard this argument before, because almost the same justification was used before the 2003 invasion of Iraq.
My fellow citizens, at this hour, American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq, to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger.
The United States military began major combat operations in Iran. Our objective is to defend the American people by eliminating imminent threats from the Iranian regime, a vicious group of very hard, terrible people.
Back then, the world was told that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, and that war was necessary to protect global security. The result? A war that destroyed an entire country. But here's the irony. Trump himself had been one of the strongest critics of the Iraq war. So the question naturally came up. Was he repeating Bush's mistake? In reality, it looked like Trump had learned one lesson from that war. George W. Bush promised Iraqis democracy, prosperity, and a better future. But Americans watched Iraq collapse into chaos, sectarian violence, and endless conflict. And in the end, no weapons of mass destruction were ever found. Bush ended up looking like a president who had sent American soldiers to die for political and economic interests. So Trump chose not to repeat that part. He didn't promise Iranians anything. No democracy, no reconstruction, no future plan. The idea was much simpler. We go in, we remove the regime. And what happens afterward is not our problem. The first phase of the operation wasn't bombing. It was a massive cyber attack. Within minutes, large part of the internet inside Iran went down. Communication networks were disrupted, radar systems were affected, and command centers suddenly struggled to communicate with each other. The strategy was clear. Disable the command structure first, then begin the strikes. Soon after that, the first wave of attacks started. Long-range missiles targeted military bases, ballistic missile launch platforms, and radar and air defense systems. Then stealth aircraft entered Iranian airspace. The strikes focused on what military planners called first-tier targets: command centers, missile storage facilities, Revolutionary Guard bases, and sites connected to Iran's missile program. But the attack didn't only hit military targets. Hundreds of civilians inside Iran were also killed. One of the most widely reported incidents was the bombing of an elementary school, where dozens of children were killed after the building collapsed within minutes. And the targets didn't stop there. The main objective was something even bigger: to decapitate Iran's leadership itself. Within the first hours of the operation, a precision strike hit the area around the Supreme Leader's compound in Tehran during what was reportedly a meeting of top officials. The result was shocking. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei was killed, along with several senior figures from the Revolutionary Guards and Iran's security establishment. The assassination of a leader of that level isn't just a military strike. Shortly afterward, Trump appeared publicly and said, "I killed Khamenei before he could kill me." And he behaved as if the story was already over. But the killing of the supreme leader didn't end the war. It ignited the Iranian response, and that response came quickly. The sudden absence of the country's top leader created confusion inside Iran's command structure. And in moments like that, military forces and regional allies don't wait long for orders. Within hours, Iran's military network across the region began to move. Pro-Iran militias in Iraq launched rockets at American bases. The Houthis in Yemen targeted oil facilities and ships in the Gulf. And Hezbollah opened a rocket front toward northern Israel. At the same time, Iran launched its own direct response. Hundreds of ballistic missiles and drones were fired toward Israeli territory. Others targeted American bases across the Gulf region. Some of those missiles managed to break through the air defenses and landed inside Israel, causing damage to military bases and strategic infrastructure. Some Iranian missiles struck civilian areas, causing casualties. Israeli civilians soon faced similar danger as missiles and drones began targeting cities. Civilian locations in several Gulf cities were also hit, leaving people there dead and injured. Iranian missiles hit American bases in Bahrain, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Qatar. And once again, the same pattern repeated itself. Civilians caught in the middle of a war they had nothing to do with, even though some Gulf governments said they had not allowed their territory to be used for attacks against Iran. Tehran had already warned that any American base in the region would be considered a legitimate target. From Iran's perspective, the war with Washington and Tel Aviv would not stay limited. It would turn into regional confrontation. One drone strike also destroyed a highly advanced US early warning radar system, reportedly worth around $1.1 billion. And the attack didn't stop with land bases. Military reports also spoke about an attack on the US aircraft carrier USS Abraham Lincoln in the Gulf. Long-range missiles and drones targeted the carrier group, causing damage and injuries among the crew within just a few hours. What had been described as a limited and rapid operation had turned into a full regional confrontation. Israel declared a state of emergency and completely closed its airspace. Millions of civilians moved into shelters. American bases across the region raised their alert level to the maximum. In short, the entire region had entered a state of open war. But the consequences of the war didn't stop with missiles. Within hours, one of the most critical points in the global economy began to shake: the Straits of Hormuz. This narrow waterway, through which about 1/5 of the world's oil trade passes, suddenly became a war zone. Commercial ships began avoiding the route. Insurance companies sharply raised their premiums, and some oil tankers stopped selling altogether. The effects showed up quickly in the global markets. Oil prices jumped within days. Gas and energy prices started rising across Europe and Asia. When oil prices rise, gasoline prices go up, electricity prices go up. And that means ordinary citizens in Europe and the United States end up paying part of the cost of this war, even if the fighting is happening thousands of kilometers away. The world is already dealing with an energy crisis since the Ukraine war, and any conflict in the Gulf sends another shock through global markets. And that leads to another question. If this war is this expensive and has caused this much escalation, then who exactly benefits from it? Well, the first clear beneficiary of this war is Israel itself. Weakening Iran effectively removes the biggest regional rival Israel faces. It also means weakening the network that supports Israel's opponents across the region. Groups in Yemen, Iraq, Lebanon, and other allied forces connected to Tehran. And in practical terms, that strengthens Israel's influence across the Middle East. But Israel may not be the only one benefiting from the timing of this war. Donald Trump also stood to gain politically. The war erupted at a moment when he was facing growing pressure inside the United States, especially with renewed media attention on his past connections to Jeffrey Epstein case. Critics argued that the timing wasn't a coincidence, because once the war started, those scandals quickly disappeared from the front pages. Trump's critics also argued that economic interests may have played a role in the decision making, especially considering what happened on Wall Street after the war began. Shares of American defense companies jumped within days. Companies like Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, and RTX Corporation show major gains. And the reason is simple: every missile fired in a war has to be replaced with a new one. Every air defense system that gets used has to be restocked. And all of that means weapons contracts worth billions of dollars. And of course, the bill is ultimately paid by American taxpayers, many of whom were already opposed to the war. At the same time, major energy companies such as ExxonMobil, Chevron, and Shell were making huge profits as oil and gas prices surged. So the same war that destroyed cities and shook the global economy was, for some players, a significant financial opportunity. And that's where many people start asking a more uncomfortable question. Donald Trump always presented himself as a deal maker, as a peace president. But what happened here led some observers to see a very different picture. And instead of ending wars, he had entered another one in the Middle East. And instead of lowering tensions, he may have ignited a conflict that could drag the entire region into chaos. The war that was described as a quick and limited strike was beginning to look like a serious dilemma for the United States. Many Americans started asking a simple question: how did the United States enter this war in the first place without a vote in Congress as the bombing and counterattacks continued? Another problem began to appear inside the US military. Missile stockpiles started shrinking, especially the interceptor missiles used in air defense systems. These missiles are extremely expensive, and long wars consumed them very quickly. With every new wave of incoming missiles, the United States had to fire interceptor missiles worth millions of dollars just to stop them. them. Because of that, Washington's tone slowly began to shift. The rhetoric that started with escalation gradually turned into talk about de-escalation, dialogue, and returning to negotiations. But the problem was that the other side wasn't ready to step back so easily. Iran's Revolutionary Guard made it clear that it would not negotiate while under bombardment, and that the war would continue as long as the strikes continued. And that leads to the real question. Did Trump pull the United States into a war that he doesn't actually know how to get off? Because starting wars can sometimes be easy. Ending them is always the hardest part. So what do you think, guys? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to hit the like and subscribe if you haven't yet. See you in the next one.